got it.
Yes. So I suppose what I'm going for with this podcast, there's a few reasons to do it. The main one is like, it was actually Mike that mentioned that he's going to start a podcast just to do, like, to be able to talk with people he wants to work with. And I was like, that's a great idea to start a podcast. Like, what a great excuse to have extended conversations with people whose work I admire and want to work with, and like whether actual work comes out of it or we just have an interesting conversation. That's kind of cool. So yeah, that's one of the reasons. The other reason is like that. I suppose that's the personal interest element, and then it's nice to hit multiple interests. So the public interest element is exploring the idea of the creative process for people's journeys into considering themselves as an artist, or at least how they express their creativity in their life. For me, that's an increasingly relevant conversation, increasingly important conversation, as frivolous as it may seem.
I get that.
Yeah, right. And then there's just the also the enjoyment that I take in the conversations and the philosophy, I suppose, of what it underlies what I'm trying to do in the world and what other people are trying to do in the world as well. So getting some transparency on that. Yeah.
Cool. That sounds great. I'm glad I can be your kind of like test run.
Yeah, well, hey. Yeah. I mean, that's another thing that I realized is when I put when I made this call out for talent for this show that I'm working on, and my plan was to put it on all these like professional theatre groups and like theatre and writers guilds, and like I'll work with real professionals. That's cool. And I did all that, but I got the most responses from just putting it on my personal page. Yeah. And then I was like, at first I was like, I know all these people. Like I kind of was hoping to work with professionals, but then after a little bit, I was like, hang on a second, I know awesome people. Like these people are great. And why don't I just start with who I know and, work outwards from there. Cool. So, anyway.
How's that going anyway? Have you kind of got your group that you need together? Or do you want to kind of leave that conversation for another time?
I mean, if we get there, I'm happy to talk about that. But let's keep it focused on, on my guest. On this podcast, yet to be named podcast. Cool. So maybe just a good place to start would be how has your journey into creativity been? Like where are you at now in terms of what you're trying to create in the world, and how did you get to where you are? So that's a very, very big question. So
that's a massive question.
Feel free to go.
Just wanted to check, did you want to do some kind of like podcasty introduction thing and like introduce us in some way, or do you want to just dive into questions?
I kind of just want to dive into questions, but maybe like a bit of background as to like who we are, but I think my question kind of prompts that from you.
Yeah, totally.
So if you want to start with it, like work a bit of who you are into that question of like, where are you at now with your creativity and how'd you get there? Yeah.
So I feel like my creativity, and I've been thinking about this for the last week since you asked me to do this and kind of gave me that prompt. And it's been a really nice reflection because I feel like Joseph Campbell and his work has been a massive inspiration for me in terms of considering what my art is and like how the creative process and my creating something, what I want from that, either for myself or as a thing that I'm offering to others. And it's very rare that I share my art. Like I do actually have, if you go to my Facebook and albums, like a couple of albums of what I've labeled weird art, and it's kind of like digital Jackson Pollock, surreal weirdness or abstract stuff. But I feel like that those pieces of art have really come from my background in therapy and my interest in Joseph Campbell and my interest in kind of uncovering the layers of myself and letting them speak for me. So it's kind of like, I wouldn't say that in terms of pencil and pen art or paintbrush art that I'm very good as an artist, but as in terms of I wouldn't necessarily be able to draw a realistic thing. But when it comes to just sitting down and Jackson Pollocking on a piece of paper, like, anyone can kind of do that. But my process has really been trying to drop into something that wants to come through in that moment, and letting that move me. And at least back in 2012, when I started traveling for the first time, I spent a year in India, and a lot of that time, there's a lot of hashish in India, and I was quite high quite a lot of the time.
Great. Good way to appreciate India. Yeah. Sampling the local products.
Yeah. Well, it's everyone. Well, I mean, everyone that I was meeting was doing it, so it's kind of hard to avoid.
For sure.
But I felt like from that depth of myself and doing a lot of art in that period, I was really uncovering these different parts. And it's something that since then I've studied psychotherapy, and I feel like the difference between art therapy and talk therapy or certain process-oriented therapies is that the art therapy, it kind of uncovers something different to the talk therapy, and it's like and we might go into the integral stuff later, but it's kind of the pre-verbal parts of myself. So if I'm talking to someone, then I'm talking from quite rational cognitive place, whereas if I'm doing art, it's some other place that is coming, other thing that is coming through, and I quite like that distinction. So when I'm creating art, it's either because I'm exploring myself and I'm just wanting to kind of scribble on the page and kind of like drop into an emotion or drop into a felt sense of something there and let that express. And it can also kind of be that I'm not in touch with something, but then something on the page jumps out at me and I'm kind of like, oh, this kind of feels like this thing, and it kind of brings something up in me from drawing something. And I really enjoy that whole process. But the other part of my desire for creativity, and again, this is kind of inspired by my integral love of integral, my interest in integrals, something that Ken Wilber, who sort of inspired integral theory, and I'm not sure how much you'd like me to kind of explain integral in this conversation, but I could do a quick, unless you want to do a quick.
Oh, look, I feel like I want to go where the juice of the conversation is, and I don't want to get too bogged down in explaining code. So if people are interested and they want to look more into integral, I very much welcome them to do that, because they may need to do that for this conversation to be intelligible as it progresses. But yeah.
Okay, cool. So without going into too much of the lingo, Ken Wilber, who created integral, said something that really stuck with me, which is that understanding the integral map as a system is a psychoactive, and the map itself talks about how human beings are developing through stages, personally and culturally. And I really like the idea of this psychoactive, like an intelligible psychoactive, or like this idea, and I think it comes up in the frameworks that I can't remember the author's name, but he's considered a genius, and he writes a book on like how to become a genius and that kind of thing. And a lot of people who talk about being geniuses are kind of they have a lot of interest. And you think about the geniuses throughout history, the people who like Isaac Newton and Einstein, and even artists like Da Vinci and whoever, they all have an interest in their primary field, but then a lot of other interests. So it's like they're polymaths. Their interests are many. And I really like this idea that our minds become more capable of synthesizing when we have more available to us in our understanding. And I think that that's kind of what integral does to a certain degree. It's kind of like understanding the map becomes a psychoactive to understanding ourselves. And in the same way that when one starts personal development, they might be like looking at a system like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or whatever, and kind of being like, oh, there's this thing, but then there's all these other things, and kind of seeing the links between the different things, seeing their place within that, and then understanding the possibilities for themselves and the limitations and the hurdles and stuff. So the other part of my desire for my creativity has always had a little semblance of wanting to provide some kind of psychoactive for the person perceiving or experiencing the thing. So I think when I first met you, we were really excited creating this party together, and we had this like idea of this ritual entranceway that was supposed to kind of drop people into kind of recognizing that they are, you know, that they have a persona or a mask, and that they can take that off and put something new on, and that we were encouraging everyone to try that on when they arrived. And I remember I was kind of like the doorkeeper, and I was like, oh, which one will you choose? And had the opportunity for them to look in the mirror, go through like a little ritual and choose a new character. And some people really embraced that, and some people kind of like, oh yeah, this is kind of cool, but whatever, I'm just here to get drunk.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
there's so much in what you just said. There's so many directions we can go from here. But I want to zoom in on something you said earlier about how, you know, your art allows you to get in contact with like pre-verbal or non-verbal parts of yourself that might have something to say. Which I can hear your transpersonal, therapeutic background really coming through there. But I'm wondering if you can pinpoint it, when you first noticed that there were different aspects to yourself, different facets to yourself that you weren't fully aware of, but also had something quite important to say or offered you some resource that you potentially needed to unlock. Like, when did that first really become important or like powerful for you?
I think it definitely started back when I was quite young. My parents were involved in a kind of like quite obscure spiritual system, and within that system the guru had a kind of model of the psyche with his own archetypes. So I don't know, whenever that was kind of talked about to me by my parents, they definitely didn't explain it heaps well, but I do remember them talking about it at least. And I think that must have been the point where I had some semblance of like, there's these different kind of types of people, and that they can be mapped out in some way. But I think it wasn't until I was studying psychotherapy and doing processes where, actually, I'll tell you another little time when I got a hint at this. I was reading a book actually, and it was quite an obscure book that I was at university, and it was the end of my second year, and I remembered that my mum had this book, and it was called Mirrodin, and it was kind of like a book that was beautifully decorated in these Celtic pictures, and every page was a different color, and it had this Celtic designs all over the place, and it was really beautiful.
Is it Celtic or Celtic? I haven't heard Celtic before. I've heard Celtic, but
right. Okay, maybe I'm saying it wrong.
Okay, cool. I was wondering, like, maybe he's from the Celtic background, and I've been saying it wrong this whole time.
No,
anyway.
no, maybe it was a slip of the tongue.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
Yeah, I know that in Scotland they had a different version of Celtic, and in Ireland and like South England as well. But I'm not sure if the labels were said differently, or maybe
sure, could be. Like, I know Gaelic is a whole language/dialect, so I don't know how their pronunciation is. Anyway, you were saying.
Anyway, so I'll say Celtic just for the sake of, just in case. So there's this book, and I remembered it, and I was like, I'm gonna look it up, and I'm gonna buy it, because for some reason I'm being really inspired to read it. And I started reading it. It was at the end of uni, and I just finished my second year, and I was moving house and packing down stuff. And I finished reading this. I was reading this book, and it had a lot of strange stuff in it. And a lot of the stories were about this group of people who had been contacted by an entity that called itself Mirrodin. And Mirrodin, I think, is a variation on the name Merlin. And it was kind of like the entity that lived in England, and it kind of contacts groups of people and kind of guides them to do stuff.
Cool.
And yeah, so this book was talking about this stuff. And then at the end of the book, it was talking about how the book itself was a magical book to kind of activate that entity, or open that person who's reading it up to that entity. And I was kind of like, whoa, this is really strange. Like, what? Like put it to the side and kind of like didn't think about it for a while. And it definitely wasn't something that I was like into or had ever thought about before reading that book, that idea of like contacting some kind of like, I guess some people would call them like ascended masters, or, you know, there's lots of different names for that kind of thing these days. And I just had no idea at the time. But I remember I put the book down, I just finished it, read that part, and kind of maybe was a little freaked out. But I was like, okay, I've got to pack up my shit and get out of here. That's like the main task to do. But I remember, I think I smoked some pot at the time, and I was just sort of doing some methodical folding of my clothes. And as I was folding these clothes, I started kind of going into internal dialogue with myself. But at that time, I realized it was almost like that I was talking to myself, but then I realized that part of the conversation was coming from a place that didn't feel like me. And I started getting this association with that part as like a separate thing, and then I like thinking about the book, and that was kind of influencing that a lot as well. And I kind of got freaked out, and I remember running to my housemate Martin at the time. I was like, do you ever like hear voices in your head? And he was like, what? And I was like, nothing. And like run out again.
Yeah, but sure.
Well, I feel like that was also.
Remember, what was the quality of the what it had to say to you? This voice that you noticed.
It was kind of revealing that was a thing. It was kind of like the voice in my head was sort of telling me that there are voices, or that there are other things available to me that were not necessarily me, but also very much me at the same time.
Wow.
And that, I guess that was another kind of like poignant moment that let me know that there are these different parts to myself, and that they have somewhat of their own I guess thoughts and desires isn't quite right. Like they're not necessarily like, I'm not right now. I'm in a bit of more of a skeptical phase, and I'm not sure how I feel about like ascended masters and
all that.
All that. But I'm definitely happy to frame it as like a part, and I know that, and I like to think at least that the nature of parts that are in shadow, they do tend to have their own life in some way, and that we don't have as much conscious control over their expression. And that and I've definitely had other experiences where since then, more recent ones, that shadowy parts have been in dialogue with me and definitely seem quite other to myself. But
that's fascinating. And I'm just thinking about, you know, like in the sort of, you know, Western materialistic sort of model of the mind, and we sort of characterize hearing voices as a definite marker of like, you're probably schizophrenic, but definitely to be watched out for. And I just think it's very interesting when we've looked at cross-cultural studies that talking about voices that haven't been integrated, like a lot of Western schizophrenics will experience the voices as like violent, degrading, controlling, very, you know, very focused on like punishment, and, you know, quite disturbing. And, you know, I think hearing voices heard as external to yourself is disturbing at the best of times, but contrasted with the studies that they've done in India, the voices are very much more like, do the dishes. You should do the dishes now. Like,
Well,
it's kind of like a nagging mother rather than this like gremlin psychopath.
right.
And I think that's just really interesting in terms of how the repressed parts of shadow consciousness can express depending on culture. And we do have a culture in the West that definitely revels in violence. If you look at what the media that we consume and create, but contrasted with places like Bollywood, where there's still violence, but very much sort of kitschy and underscored with love stories and whatnot. So yeah, I think the question of the divided self is fascinating, and I also like to imagine that the kind of ascended masters or Buddha consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is potentially accessible to anyone. Given the right state to tap into. So yeah, that's a really great example of being that part of yourself being revealed to you. And it sounds like that book that you read was quite a psychoactive work.
Yeah, that's it, right? And yeah, and it's funny because of the skeptical place I'm in right now. I feel almost like it's really hard to create something that would do that to someone else, because I don't necessarily think that. I think that there's maybe for me, I took a healthy approach to the experiences, but I can imagine that other people, if they had started experiencing that, would have freaked out more.
Oh, it can really set you off the deep end, and a lot of people do go off the deep end as well.
Yeah, that's it. So it's not something that I would play with lightly in terms of creating psychoactives or claiming that anything like that is even possible, right?
For sure.
And I think that's another reason why I really appreciate the integral lens, is because it's all about integration with discernment. And I really, like right now, for a while I've been really interested in how to rescue the baby out of the bathwater with a lot of spiritual systems or kind of new age ideas, and like acknowledge that there are things going on that we probably scientifically haven't figured out yet. And how do we, not throw those things away, and still use them, but use them in a very conscientious, kind of trauma-informed and grounded and safe way. And yeah, in terms of art, yeah, I wouldn't know. I haven't really thought about how to even begin that process.
Perhaps it's worth just talking about, when I talk about art and creativity, I don't just mean like drawing or writing, but like I like to think of our creative capacity as being evident at all times, at all levels, and so like when I talk about creativity, I'm actually also talking about that mental attitudes that we're bringing in a certain moment, the space of awareness, and where our focus is. Like, what am I creating in this moment right now? Cool. What am I curious about? What am I taking for granted? Like, for me, that's all part of the creative process, and also really important for any artist, but any human as well, which makes the possible discussion so expansive as to like where do we go from here. But a question I'd like to ask you is how has integral theory informed your creative process currently? And I know you're talking about games that might be able to take people through a journey and be psychoactive. So yeah, I'm just wondering, what you're currently working on to be able to provide a responsible psychoactive experience for people and what you're creating.
Well, great question. I just happened to be working on a project that's been a quite a journey. It started in university back in 2006 or 2007 as a video game project, and since then it's morphed into a novel, and more recently back into a video game project. And essentially it's my psychoactive. It's partly the experiences that I've had and gone through distilled into kind of like a journey form and a narrative. And it's partly an attempt, I guess, to, and this is something that is really dear to my being in terms of like moment to moment creativity is the capacity to help create a sense of like, oh, there's could be something different, or like it's kind of like the call to adventure. It's the whisper on the wind that like, oh, life maybe isn't exactly what I thought it was, or this reality isn't exactly what I thought it was, and or this
The
moment
messenger of
could be
chaos, I
different.
think,
Yeah,
is a way that Campbell might have phrased that.
yeah. And it's funny that you say that. It feels a little bit like, let's say I'm at a festival and I feel a little bit more freedom to play that role of the or at a party or something, and I can really get the sense of this kind of low key trickster part of me that,
Absolutely.
you know, it can be a little bit chaotic, but it can also be quite like subtle at times as well, and just sort of, yeah, it can be just that whisper on the wind, and it's just like, oh, what about this though, and like, or just a good question at the right moment, or like a statement at the right moment. And I like that character a lot. Yeah, the trickster kind of chameleon-y thing that kind of appears and says something, then disappears again.
The person's like, what?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
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 It's an interesting character. I engage a lot with the trickster as well in terms of an archetype that informs my work. I've done a lot of what would I call it? I've called it demonic clowning in the past, which can give the wrong impression. Sometimes I call it deep clowning, but it's very much an embodiment of the trickster ethic. And for me, there's definitely a dark element to it, as well as a light aspect to it. You know, and often it can be a reflexive thing. And for me, the joy in it is looking at the dark and turning it into the light. And vice versa, and letting that process be really, really dynamic and witnessed.
Yeah, it's such an important character as well. I feel like in mythology or in legends, or in reality, there's the jester, the court jester, and the purpose is to kind of like make fun of the king or queen or the sovereign without getting its head cut off. You know, it's
Totally.
kind of like
And he's the only one in the
ego
room that
down.
can tell the truth. Because of his special status.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like this ability to cut the ego's head off, and reveal the truth underneath, but in a way that is kind of digestible, I guess. Like
digestible
comedy.
or loving, or sees the beauty or absurdity at least in it.
Yeah.
For me, there can be a real darkness to it when there's the cutting off the ego and like, what about this? But then there's also this, and I'm also right in this and this way, you know? Or there's also this like fixation of like, haha, I have the real answers. And I see that a lot in the, on the online world and in my Facebook feed right now in the times of COVID, in the conspiracy circles, and the way that, dialogue often gets played out in this sort of dark trickster way, where it's like, aha, I have the real answers, those other ones are such fools.
Yeah.
You know?
That's such an interesting thing as well, because I feel like I feel quite happy that more people are getting into conspiracies, because it does feel like a stage of development in some way.
Sure.
Like,
yeah,
it's
I went down the deep end for conspiracies, thinking
Me
that
too.
everything was controlled and orchestrated, and it's a very worrying. It's not a happy place. Like I was not a happy person when I was in that place.
Yeah, that's it.
Which is ultimately why I got out of it. But
it does show the desire to see beyond the veil, right? Behind the curtain, and I think that in that place, people are desperate for the truth and the real the person behind the curtain, and to be able to kind of like explain it, because that's safety. And I think without that safety and that clear explanation, it's kind of floundering in the unknown, right? And that's harder for people than to have the answer in some way. Yeah.
Cool. And so you've got this, so in your creative work, you've got this sort of trickster element that you like to bring in a way, and it sounds like you're similar to me, that you use it to provoke curiosity and exploration rather than to be like, and the universe is controlled by the ascended masters, and in order to really ascend, you need to channel them.
Yeah.
You know? There's
Not
not necessarily a reveal, but you know.
Yeah, I have quite a shadow around that. I mean, it's like a reluctance to have my own. Like, I could never. Right now, I don't feel like I feel very comfortable being any kind of like guru or thought leader or anything like that, because I'm kind of like, I ask the questions and I disappear. It's kind of like that's the safe place, you know?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
and that's got its own light and shadow, which we could go into. But
yeah, I was going to say there's shadow under that, but it's a nice place to be. I think it makes a good therapist, like asking a question and stepping back and kind of listening and being with the other person's persona and ego and transcendent parts and things, and not interjecting my own stuff into that too much. But yeah, I feel
I think we're sort of getting at what it might mean to make responsible psychoactive material. Is that as creators, we really do need to let people come to their own conclusions. Whether that's in therapy or whether that's in art that is therapeutic, as a lot of art can be.
And that's what the key to both therapy and from the research that I've read in helping people in psychosis even, is normalizing their experience. And it's kind of like, yes, whatever you say you're experiencing, that's okay, that's cool. Like, not freaking out about it, It's like, okay, it's interesting what you're saying there, and like, oh, I can understand that must be hard, and like really empathizing with someone and normalizing their experience. Obviously, there's also a responsibility to not kind of get carried away and make something that maybe is slightly unhealthy to believe in. Like, if someone's going through psychosis and like, oh, the aliens are out to get me, then you don't go like, yeah, there are aliens, they're out to get me. Like, that's not the way to normalize the experience.
There's still a place of integrity that is required to speak from. And so what place of integrity are you speaking from in what you're creating with this game, the project that you've been working on?
Well, like I was saying, it's been a long time coming, and I'm somewhat frustrated with myself that it's taking so long. But I'm actually, right now, I'm in New Zealand studying software engineering and computer programming, so that I can put more time and energy into creating that particular project, because I actually have the skills now, or at least I'm developing the skills now to do it. But it's been a long time coming, and it's been changing quite a lot, and I feel like it's morphed over time. It's kind of shifted from, like at one point, maybe when I was traveling India especially, it had a lot more of a spiritual Eastern hippie New Age themes and feel to it.
Right.
And then like I introduced more like a bit later on a more therapeutic understanding, and then like the integral understanding is kind of like, oh yeah, that's got some truth, and that's got some truth, and how do we best use that? But the real purpose of it, I guess, or the desire of it, is to be somewhat like the Matrix movies, which has always been the inspiration for me, in terms of you can watch the movie, like the first movie, as just like a cool martial arts cyberpunk action flick with some interesting themes, and it's like, cool, that's all it is. Or you can watch it as like, oh, this is a political movie about authority and rebelling against authority, and the us and them stuff, and if you're in that phase, it can look like that. Or it can be, oh, it's a spiritual movie, and it's about transcending the matrix that is our reality, and then like coming out as it could be like a Gnostic allegory of like the soul and all that kind of stuff. So you can kind of view it in different ways, but essentially you can just be entertained by it if you want to. And that's kind of the core of my desire for my project as well. It's like, I really just want to make something that's really fun and entertaining, and I want to, for those that decide that they want to look further, I want to have something really juicy and nourishing for the provocative mind and the searcher. And it's kind of like, asking those questions within the project of the game that leads to, you know, something that they may have overlooked had they just been playing it as a piece of entertainment.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and that really excites me as well, just having both of those things in there in some way.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. I'm being reminded of a lot of things now, but I'm engaging a lot with the meta-modern thought and movement, which seems to have come out of integral theory, and might be the same thing, but they seem to have put a distinction there, which seems kind of arbitrary to me, but I'm only just getting into it, so I can't really speak on it with authority. But they talk about seducing people into higher consciousness, you know, like we must seduce people into more awareness. And I think, yeah, the Matrix movie is a great example of that happening. And also, really, when I'm making art, like, first off, it has to be fun or good or beautiful, you know, like first things first, it's got to be enjoyable, you know, because like the reality is that self-work is shit a lot of the time, and it's hard and it's painful. And the rewards are immense, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But it's not like a lot of the calls to self-work are like, okay, go and sit by yourself for 10 days, you know, and like you have to be a little bit insane to actually want to do that. Like you have to be in a place of a fair amount of pain to do that, to actually voluntarily, you know, sign up for the kind of rigors that real self-work sort of demands of people. And so I love this idea of media and cultural products that seduce people into a process of reflection and growing awareness through play and fun.
Yeah. Do you know, can you point to like some other good examples? Because I was like, The Matrix is such a typical one that's my go-to, but I was just thinking, what other, you know, there must be more, you know, there must be more examples.
For sure, God. Let's see, God, off the top of my head, I mean, it's something I'm trying to do it in my work at the moment that I'm making with my immersive theatre stuff of like first and foremost, it's just going to be a cool experience. I suppose, like, I mean, I think of, you know, it's also a bit cliche, but burner culture, going to a burn, you know, like it's going to be fun. There's going to be partying. You're going to get blasted off drugs if you want, or if you don't like that, you're going to dance like crazy. Like whatever you love is going to be there. And also, there will be a variety of challenges to who you think you are, which are going to be, at some point you will be in immense pain. And everyone's there for you to support that. And there are processes around to support that. But like, I feel like burner culture does really get that mix right to seduce people into a higher awareness through play.
And community. I like that you said that there's people, like if you're going through something, there's people there to support that, and that's something that's tricky with art that you're just consuming in your own home by yourself, is that if you're starting to kind of be influenced by something, and let's say I had the equivalent of the Mirrodin book that I read in the video game, you know, it's like, who do I
talk to about this?
Yeah, exactly. And how do I present that in a way that doesn't cause psychosis or whatever, like that? You know, it's hard to say that it even would, but it's also like a fear of mine. Like I don't want to hurt anyone either, as well as I want to reveal some cool stuff. And
it's an important point of the equation, I think. Like communitas, like the community of growth or exploration is like, it's been a part of every major religion, or every sect of, you know, seekers has had that element of support and intimate support and real support, real vulnerability, and also something that people are really hungry for. How you create that experience, or how you induce community through art, I think we're still kind of figuring that out.
Yeah, well, we've got Reddit.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, we've got like, now
what we've got is not great.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
terms of online mediums, yeah.
But we have space. I was just thinking that, for a video game, there's generally always some kind of forum or community spaces, if not a Reddit page,
Yeah.
where people get together and discuss stuff. And if there was a project that had some psychoactive material in it, then I'm sure that there would form quite naturally some groups around the material, like that element of it, and people would be like discussing it. And
yeah, so it's interesting. So this book I'm reading at the moment by Hansi Freibacht, I think is how you pronounce his name. It's called The Listening Society. It's a very psychoactive piece of work. And I'm at a stage in my development where I'm not finding it too disruptive, but the way he's writing calls to different parts of the being, and I can feel different parts being activated. And I'm like, this is I'm coming online here. This is cool.
Yeah.
And I know that there are enough people engaged in this way of thinking that there are various online communities that I can go to and have these discussions. This podcast is actually very much an expression of seeking communitas for this kind of thought. But yeah, so for me, I feel well resourced, but I'm also for this kind of level of engagement. But then there's other levels we talked about. You're going through your conspiracy theorist phase or whatever, where I think that a lot of the support that people offer can be very detrimental. And I'm thinking like of the black pill community, the what do you call them, the unwilling celibates, the incels. The incel community is like, there is a community that's formed around this certain sort of way of being with certain certain state of the psyche, and there is a support there, but a lot of it seems to be quite like unhealthy. Like in the black pill movement, there's a significant portion of people who are like, just kill yourself, and these are all the reasons why you should kill yourself, and like it's really quite awful, the things that are formed around there. And so it's not that clear to me that real communitas can form without bodies being in the same space and without all of the sort of biofeedback and mirror neurons that happens. What's your I don't know what if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think it would be completely tragic if because of COVID or whatever, that communities couldn't start forming in person. And I think that touch is super important. Like, we know that babies die if they don't get touched in dodgy research from ancient times.
Yep.
But yeah, because there are so many people. It's like, for people listening, Reese and I are part of a group that we call the Smoosh. And Smoosh Crew, and it's such a beautiful thing to be in a smoosh, which is like a cuddle puddle.
Yeah, it's platonic touch with friends. Yeah.
And it's something that before I was involved with and before I've experienced that, I just didn't know that I needed it. And I think that there's some semblance of like numbing or coping or something that happened before I realized that I needed it. There was, I could live my life pretty happily without it. But then when I experienced it, I'm kind of like, oh no, where's that thing?
Yeah. I mean, what's the difference between like a smushed Alexander and a non-smushed Alexander? Like someone who's, if you get a nice sort of 3 hours of intimate platonic touch, being patted, stroked, hugged.
There's definitely a nervous system relaxing, like a major nervous system shift and an altered state, and relaxation. It just feels nourishing to my being to have gone through that experience, and it feels there's a safety in there as well. Like I know that everybody's very open to whatever state anyone who comes to the smoosh is in, so it's kind of it feels very accepting, and like if I'm not okay, then people are just like, that's okay,
yeah.
So there's a regulatory.
So there's probably a degree of shame that gets transformed or healed there, and I'm wondering, like, if you can hazard a guess, like, if you have a smoosh on a Sunday, get it all nice and topped up versus not, like, how might your week look differently? Like,
I think I'd generally be more stressed.
Yeah.
I'd generally be more tighten my being, and and when I'm more stressed, I'm more irritable, and my shadows come out more easily, and just not as good of a person, I think, when I'm not relaxed in that way. But at the same time, I feel like definitely a smoosh is an amazing thing, and I think that a decent kind of like self-pleasure or meditation or mixture of the both can kind of cultivate some of that stuff, and like there are other ways to cultivate a relaxed nervous system, for example.
It's a sense of fullness, and like, I don't have to worry about my survival. I'm being taken care of. Seems to be the message that I take away from the smooshes.
Yeah, and I think luckily for me, I'm living with my partner Ari, so I get lots of cuddles from her. So even though I definitely miss smoosh, I also am getting my need for touch met as well. So it's hard to say what complete absence of that would be like for me right now.
I can say from first hand, self-pity becomes much easier when there's no touch.
Yeah.
And that's an edge I've identified today, and I want to work with this week. But
cool.
But I want to get back to your game project, and so we've sort of talked about how there's this trickster element that you're playing with, and if there's a real sort of core of integrity, it's that it's fun, that it's enjoyable, that it's dynamic, and pulls people in because it's an awesome experience. And I suppose what am I wondering? I'm just wondering what I'm wondering about this game. The riddle for me is to, I guess how's that going? Because I know for my immersive theatre piece that I'm working on, which is also intended to be quite psychoactive. There's so many moving parts, and the complexity is just like, it's huge. And so how's the implementation process?
It's challenging and overwhelming. There's so much to it, and there's so many things that I'm trying to cram in to the experience as well. And it's kind of like one of the challenges that I've faced, because I want to include the stages of development and integral and have an expression of those, but I also want to demonstrate a transition from one stage to another, and that requires kind of knowing what that looks like in an individual, and I think that's quite an elusive thing, and it's quite personal and unique to each individual as well. But it's kind of like finding out what the call to adventure is at each stage, and it changes each time, and it's kind of like sort of sowing doubt to a particular ideology. And I think that's quite a skill, and it's not something that I'm completely clued up about, like how to do that. So it sort of feels like that element of it is somewhat halting progress, I guess, of like trying to explore and integrate into the project the characters putting on of a new way of thinking, and then kind of doubting it, and like even just talking about it now, I'm kind of like, oh, actually, wait, maybe, because each stage of development is kind of like a rebellion of the previous stage, and like a seeking for something more new, kind of like the conspiracy, where there's the stepping into the unknown, but then there's this thing that is the new truth.
Yes.
And at that beginning part, when this new truth is found, it's kind of like, oh, grab onto that. And I feel like at each stage, the new truth is quite tightly held for a while. And I think Ken Wilber again talks about how stage development can take years, and meditation can help alleviate those stage changes. But I have to maybe fake it a little bit in terms of the reality of an individual going through stages. But I'm just imagining how the new truth becomes part of their persona and their way of thinking, and then it somehow is temporary still for that person, and then it becomes the old truth, and they rebel against it. And I think to do that could be by displaying conflict within each paradigm.
Yeah.
So like the paradigm could be a rebellion against the previous stage, but also within that paradigm itself having a kind of like left and right polarity to the paradigm itself.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum to display that, because I feel like my understanding of integral theory is that not only do we move through stages as individuals and we have our own unique journey with that, but we're also occupying all stages that we've moved through before at all times, and they're always in relationship and their own stage of development with and that's all affected by each other. And so it's not like I get to green, and now I'm green. Like I still have the drive for power. I still have the drive for order and coherence. But now, like the main question is this, like question of like inclusion and equality, and how do I live that? And but all the things are still active at the same time. And I wonder if it's possible to recreate that journey for people, because in a way it really is an individual journey, and that's why I like metamodernism's focus on interiority. Like actually our inner experiences matter, and not only do they matter for ourselves, they also matter for everyone else socially and politically. And so let's talk about that and what that means. And yeah, I wonder if there's like a place for a focus on interiority, for the characters to sort of really be able to represent their own experience in terms of the choices they're making, and they can move up and down the spiral depending on that. But it's the deeper you go into green or any of the things, the deeper you go into it, the higher you build that castle, the more the cracks start forming, and eventually you get collapse. And I feel like for me, just reflecting on my development, like everyone likes to think they're at integral, right? When I first came across integral theory, I was like, oh yeah, I'm at integral. But like reflecting on how, like, working out with indigenous communities out in the desert, and really coming at that from a green social justice lens of like, what we're dealing here is with inequality. We need to just be able to include other people's ways of being, and we'll be able to, we'll get more equality, and things will be better. And realizing how much that just breaks down if we don't also have a degree of high coherence and the idea of progression. And there was part of me that really hated engaging with integral thought when I was out in the desert, because I was like, oh, this is this like Western imperialist view of consciousness, and there was a real allergic reaction that my sort of green heart was having at the time. But ultimately, to be effective in that environment, I needed to make this transition into complex thinking and say, well, actually, a lot of people here are just out for themselves, and that's okay. I can work with that. I can accommodate that. And we can also start bringing in concepts of higher order, and that's why the most functional people out in those communities are often the ones that have a strong church background. And so that's the transition of consciousness that those communities seem to be at. And I'm not saying it's limited to that. I've met some incredible complex thinkers out there, but being okay with that, and then being also able to talk to the green government level and accommodate their interests, and find the point where we can actually create good outcomes was helpful for me. But it was really turbulent for that time, for a time there, and probably still will be next time I go out there.
But I think you hit a good point there, which is that I think the integral and probably meta-modern intention isn't to necessarily make everybody integral. Like, that's not the goal. It's the people who are approaching integral to step up into leadership and start to create systems that are inspired by integral, and to like exactly what you did.
That can accommodate everyone's interests and create a system that facilitates virtuous behavior.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's not about trying to accommodate state change or stage change necessarily, but like you said, to see where people are at and to find what's best for them and to understand them in that moment. And that's an integral leadership would, I assume, need that quality, right? Like the empathy and the understanding. And I think that's a good point for my game project as well. At one point, it definitely was the attempt at making people integral in some way, and what you said before, where people who start to think about integral start to be like, oh yeah, I'm integral or whatever. And there's the distinction with the lines of development as well. So the first, what Ken Wilber says is that usually the cognitive line is the highest, and the rest follow after that. So once we cognitively understand a higher stage, we can start to align our values, or start to align our creativity, or start to, whatever, the different lines of ourselves start to follow after we've cognitively got it.
That spark of like, happens.
Yeah. So you can be cognitively integral, but still your center of gravity could be blue or orange, or pre-rational in some way. And I think with my game project, having realized that more, that sort of thrown a spanner in the works a bit with my intentions. And I still want to teach and reveal integral theory and how it looks in a like interactive environment. Like that hasn't changed. And there's like, it's a sci-fi kind of adventure, and there's this city in the clouds, kind of like, I was inspired a little bit by the Hermann Hesse book, The Glass Bead Game, if you know that one. And
I have heard of it. I've not yet read it, but I've heard the philosophical implications are worth it.
Yeah, and there's the city in the clouds, and there's the sort of elite that kind of understand the system that's at play, and you eventually end up there as a character in the game that I'm creating, and sort of understanding the system from their perspective, and then going back into the areas that you've already explored to kind of unpack that more and trying to unite the human race through shared values and understanding and things. And yes, it's always been quite an ambitious project.
Yeah, you do not lack the ambition, and I guess the question on my mind is like, who is this for, this game?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think it's for me. Like, I really want to play it, and it's for people who maybe have already got somewhat of a grasp on or interest in like Joseph Campbell or myth or integral or metamodernism. People who are maybe more philosophically inclined and like to think about ideas, because I want to fill it with interesting ideas and sort of, like some kind of empiricism and some kind of idealism and the conflict and where they meet and where they don't. And it's kind of like my attempt at synthesizing what I know through a creative expression in some way. And I think coming to think about it, it has always been a bit of that. Like, it has always been a reflection of what I'm going through currently. But if I do too much of that, then it doesn't have an end, because obviously while I'm alive, it can always
things.
change.
Totally, yeah.
So I need to kind of wrap it up and create full circle.
And I think just from my uninformed opinion, if there is a dark side to integral thought, it is that we can just make things a bit too complex sometimes, that we can see all the complexity in things, and that it doesn't necessarily translate to behavior. And I suppose that's why a question in my mind is like, okay, cool, we've got this understanding of integral. What does that look like, in terms of how we live our lives, our political projects, our creative projects? I think that's an emerging area that we're trying to figure out.
I think the most obvious sign of integral thinking for me is empathy, like expanded empathy and through understanding. And I know that's just one. Well, to be fair, it's just one line, but I feel like because cognitive line, I feel like there's a. Oops, I'm just grabbing my mic. I think there's an understanding within the integral community that you don't have to be talking integral to be integral. You don't have to be sort of using the lingo and using the words that integral means. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that there's probably more people living integrally and expressing integrally than are interested in integral theory itself.
That's definitely my experience. Like in terms of the people I associate with, of all the people I would sort of think are like, oh, they're really living an integral life, maybe 20% have actually heard of integral theory.
Yeah, exactly. And I always meet people and they're kind of like talking about somewhat similar stuff. I'm like, oh, have you ever heard of integral theory? And like, no. I was like, is it worth kind of trying to put that like model on top of it? But,
yeah. Is there a benefit to be had here? Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. I think there is. Like that. I think that. So there's Ken Wilber's integral theory, and then there's some certain offshoots of integral theory, in an attempt to evolve integral theory, like Integral 2.0, and various groups that are looking for evolution of the model and including more modern research and understanding. And there's still got a ways to go. And I think that it's not the point of evolution is that it's not finished.
No, it never is. Yeah. Where do I want to go? Where do we want to go from here?
We've been chatting for an hour, so.
Are you at about time?
I mean, no, I've got plenty of time, but I'm just letting you know that.
I feel like there's a little bit more to be said here.
Yeah.
If there's any benefit in integral theory, I think it is in developing similar language around what our aspirations are. Because one thing I'm really loving about the Listening Society is it outlines a political project, which wasn't really part of integral theory, which Hansi's criticism of integral theory is that because it lacked a political project, it became quite inwards looking and very focused on language and categorization and hasn't really rippled out and expand outward into the world.
Yeah.
And so I think, articulating what we need to do as people who believe in the evolution of consciousness is really worthwhile. Who believe in the evolution of consciousness and science, I think is an important distinction that integralists would adhere to. And I also just want to bring in this idea of the precariat. Are you familiar with this concept?
I mean, it sounds like precarious.
Yeah, so this was an emerging class. I forget the name of the theorist that sort of signaled it in the early part of the 21st century, but that were precariats characterized by increasingly unstable work conditions, the gig economy, and there seems to be a few different segments of the precariat. Like a lot of the precariat is sort of Trump's people, people who are very much in the industrial era who have been left behind by globalization and no longer have secure work. Also, transitory populations like migrants and people who come into countries for work but all of a sudden don't have citizen rights and may never have citizen rights. But then there's also the sort of liberal brand of the precariat, which is like, I would include us in that. Like, we're pretty highly educated and pretty highly skilled. Like, I have a law degree and a mediation practice. You're doing computer science and you have a psychotherapy degree. Like, we have a lot to offer society, but the work offered to us isn't of the quality that is sufficiently nourishing for us to either want to do it for very long or... I do think our class is often a precariat by choice. Like, if we really, really wanted full-time work, we could do it, but it's actually too painful to my soul to enter into most of the full-time work that's offered because I can't ignore what I see in society as as needing to be worked on. And so we find ourselves in these positions of economic instability. You know, I haven't had any work come in for the last sort of 6 months, and I hopefully will have some work coming in soon. But I just wanted to bring in this concept of the precariat and integralists, that there seems to be a really big overlap there. The highly skilled people who have a lot to offer but don't really have the nodes in society to contribute at our capacity at this stage.
Yeah, there's a big there's a big challenge, right? Like what you were saying before about the sort of armchair philosopher style of being an integralist, and just having a cognitive map doesn't mean that you're going to be, doing good stuff in the world, or even like people who are really into socialism but more of an armchair philosopher and would never go out to a march, or activists who kind of like are really angry with the government but wouldn't, join in the Black Lives Matters movement, or to join in with the actual group of people who are trying to make change in the world.
Yeah.
And I understand the kind of hopelessness and frustration of, in integral theory, you've got the lower right quadrant, which is systems, and that's the part that is kind of like, they're all interface with each other, but the systems right now, I feel, are quite limiting us. Like the systems that we have right now, unless you're in a privileged position, including like monetarily, you're not going to be making big waves in the systems area of stuff, at least in a larger scale. And it's sort of like rigid and still, industrial era society of the construction of ancient times still exists in our modern structures, and that's like the most rigid thing, and I think that's the precariat are kind of like a consequence of that, like the inability for society to progress in ways that can provide freedom, individual freedoms to express the skill sets that we're kind of we're developing in this, a lot of other areas are sort of growing and evolving quite rapidly, and then the platform of which we have to actually express those things has sort of stagnated for a long time. And I like that frame of being able to, it's like the systems, obviously, like trying to change those is feels like such a hard task, an overwhelming task, an impossible task. It's like, how do we change the world? Like,
it's very much the frustration, isn't it? Like, how do we do it? And I think that's probably like the main question we should be asking, like the main political project that we need to be undertaking. We've all got different ways to do that, I guess.
Yeah, I like to think that there are more realistic transition steps towards world change. Like, I really believe in universal basic income if it's done well, and universal basic services, because I believe that if the lower classes and lower socioeconomic classes can be relieved of their stress of just like survival, kind of like meeting Maslow's pyramid of needs, if we can shift like the whole world up a step on that pyramid, then that gives people freedom and time to develop themselves in ways, and to think of interesting projects, and to find solutions. It's like freeing up more minds on the planet to find solutions for the problems.
Absolutely, yeah. I really like that idea, because it's like, what are the odds that like any of us are gonna come up with the solution that revolutionizes a particular problem? Probably really small, probably like 1 in 100,000, let's just say, But if there's 500,000 of us that are relieved from the mundanity of, bullshit work, then the odds that one of us are actually going to do it all of a sudden becomes 5 to 1,
Yeah.
And
exactly.
like, people look at the society that we might be creating as like, oh my, like, really? You're just going to let people just goof off all the time? And my answer is like, yeah, like, self-creation might not look like much in terms of productive work, but it is incredibly rich and
Yeah.
can be incredibly productive.
It reminds me of my preference for creative time is where, and this was much easier when I was traveling in India. I just have my guitar and my art supplies and a book and like some food and some water, and I just go for a really long walk somewhere and just find a beautiful spot, and then just kind of whatever was inspiring me in that moment would occur.
Yeah.
And it could be just, oh, just like sit, or it could be I'll do some art, or it could be, oh, I've got this really good idea and I'll journal that or something. And it's that space and freedom and nervous system relaxation that creates the opportunities for those things to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can imagine like allowing that on a mass scale would be really beautiful. It could be really.
It would be beautiful.
potent.
Like I'm just thinking, it's like a harmonization with beauty. You're just spending a little bit of time to get in touch with what beauty looks like.
Yeah.
For
Because
you.
people think that everyone would get lazy and just be eating chips and watching Netflix all day, but that's really unsatisfying. Like the
It's
reason
shit.
why the reason
as
why people
lockdown has shown us, it's
Yeah,
a shit way
exactly.
to live.
I feel like the only reason why people actually do that is because they're working so hard the rest of the week that they have no
Yeah.
energy to do anything else other than just kind of like relax into this kind of stupor of binge eating and showing and whatever.
For sure. There's another idea in the listening society. There's so many ideas, but one of them is that each person, from age whatever 6, 7, gets a psychologist to see, once a week or once a fortnight
Right.
or once a month, just
Yeah.
a friendly adult who's competent without an agenda to listen to and encourage development. And like,
Great.
if everyone had that, like, imagine where we'd be as a society. Like,
Yeah. Well, imagine if we actually acknowledged the reality of stages of development and built into our schooling system and our society at large the helping people develop through the stages from the beginning. Like we could have little geniuses creating the future for
for sure, for
Cool
sure.
thing.
And and that's also, there's also like, I'm getting like a warning bell there, being like, it's not a given that everyone's going to make it to integral or even green or even
No.
orange, So I'd be very careful of creating more oppressive hierarchies in that. Like, it's important to have growth hierarchies, and then it's also important to not, crush people.
Yeah, and you're not forcing people to be integral, but I think that the opportunity to kind of, it's kind of like we're teaching evolution and creationism in schools. So it's kind of like, oh yeah, we've got some orange and some blue in there. It's like, what if we, what if we added some more subjects to choose from? It's like, it's just having a more well-rounded education. It's not saying we have to get rid of like parts of it.
No, for sure. Yeah, cool. I am excited about the potential political projects that will come out of this line of thinking, and the question, the real focus that I and you both seem to have in our work is like wanting people to take seriously their own power of self-creation. Like, that's worth taking seriously.
Yeah.
And if there's I feel like that is one of my main messages that underlies my artistic work. And if people do take that seriously, then I think we would be looking at a pretty amazing world. But yeah, I'll just maybe close off with the thought that this idea of the precariat, the theorist that proposed it said it is actually the first revolutionary class, because the other economic classes have only ever sought to further their own interests. The proletariat wants to get paid more, the bourgeoisie want more rent, rah, rah, rah. But the precariat actually wants to annihilate the conditions that have created them,
Cool.
And so I feel like that's a heartening take on things. Be like, oh yeah, like the economic factors that create my space, who I am in this class, I want to fundamentally change them so they don't exist. I don't just want a plushier cage.
Yeah, totally. So how do we rally the precariat to rebel?
Yeah,
against the
I
system?
don't think it's rebellion. I honestly don't.
Okay.
I think these projects are happening everywhere, and I think we're seeing it. Like I think we're seeing a more of a focus on interior, on the importance of our inner experience. You know, like we've got the various mental health crises happening in the West, and that seems to be bringing awareness and a sense of needed action. So something that our listeners might not know about me is that last year I started, I created a startup just based on my own nonviolent communication and coaching practice on helping men to express themselves better through one-on-one coaching and online program. So I was calling tradies, bricklayers, you know, dudes, manly men who I don't normally, you know, I wouldn't normally seek out and have a very different lived experience from me. And they were like very, I would say, largely receptive to the idea that they could be better at being better to themselves and expressing themselves. There was still a lot of resistance there, which I found it very difficult to actually get to a point where they'd agree to work with me. There's probably some of my own limitations. There's definitely my own limitations in that mix. But I don't think that conversation could have been had even, 10 or 20 years ago to the degree that it's being had now.
Yeah. Beautiful. That's really cool. Yeah.
Cool. Well, is there anything else to be said about self-creation, art?
Maybe I'll just plug that if you're listening to this and you're a video game designer, then get in touch with me because I need help.
Cool.
Plug for myself.
A plug for an exciting psychoactive game project. Yeah. I'm wanting to think of like other examples of seducing people with change, but we might leave it there. Cool, man.
I think the kind of ritual experience themes that you and I have talked about before, and the party and the different attempts to create a psychoactive to, even if it's just a questioning or a whisper on the wind or a call to adventure, it's like something just to shake people up a little bit and inspire them to try something different. I think that's a really nice, simple thing to try and attempt to do.
Yeah, it's super simple and super accessible. Like a ritual, you don't need a lot for a ritual. You need a container, you need a moment of transition, you need the space of liminality where you don't know what's going to happen next. And it's nice to have something to aim for as well in that space. But sometimes it can be totally aimless as well. And then there's a process of emergence, and then you have an integration phase, and like that can be very easily designed into any element of your life, into your day, your week, into any process.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been really fun chatting with you. It's nice to chat about my video game project in a way that is good questions and kind of unpacking it a bit more, because it's giving me more insight into maybe what needs to happen next.
Yeah, I'm glad that that's helpful. And I find similarly, I can trick myself into thinking that I know exactly what's going on with my project, but it's only when someone's curious about it and asking questions and I have to explain it that I'm like, hang on a second, there's more to be found here. Yeah. Cool. All right, great. Well,
nice one.
That's the first podcast wrapped up.
Hooray.
Thank you everyone for listening. And if people do want to get in contact with you, where can they find you, Alexander?
It's a good question. I don't really have a way of contacting me. Like I like being elusive, as you know.
So they have to hunt you down via the internet.
I mean,
follow the breadcrumb trail.
Yeah, on Facebook I'm Alexander Vaughan. Yeah. I have a website, alexanderjenkins.com.au, and I have podcasts on there that I also share.
Is there any contact details there? Any contact form?
Yeah, there's a contact form there if you really want to get in touch.
Nice.
Yeah, I should probably get like an easy to remember email or something. Like all my emails are either obscure or um, like they're like old that I made at 16 or whatever. You know?
Yeah, Squidge Face McGee 101.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well,
Cool.
if there are any game designers, video game designers, people with tech skills that want to get to work on a psychoactive project, get in touch with Alexander. And if you would like to be a guest on my show and talk about the creative process, get in touch with me, Rhys Jakenley. I also have a website. I'll have you know, I have a website too. I'm a very important person. Flourishingonpurpose.com is my website. I've got a contact form there. But otherwise, Rhys Jakenley on Facebook is also nice and easy.